I like it again. So that's nice that I'm able to present it in this time when I am again in love with my topic. So thanks for coming, and I hope that you enjoy, and I'm also hoping that some of you might have some questions for me at the end of the talk, because that's always a nice part. I don't think my head is wide enough for the microphone, but we'll see. Okay, great. So the title of my talk is Spectacularly Mundane, and I'm hoping to convince you that although this church might initially look very exciting and unusual, that it was in fact very mundane for those who might have seen it during the time that it was constructed and used in the Middle Ages. And this is the subject of my talk. It's a very small church in northern Spain, in the region of Navarra. And it's tiny. It's in a town of approximately 170 inhabitants. And it's not the most well-studied monument in terms of art history. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why we would bother to spend the time to study a church that's kind of tucked away in the Navarrese countryside without very much kind of a particular art historical background of it. There have been some studies, but it's not, I mean, it's not like, the Sainte-Chapelle, it's not like Notre Dame, it's not like Saint-Denis. But I think one of the things that it taught me, which I thought was the most fascinating, is that this tiny church can really challenge everything that you know about a region's past, about a region's history. And so there are certain notions that people have about the north of Spain especially, that can get completely shattered by investigating such a tiny church. So about 30 years ago, there began what I see as a renewed interest in Spain. Probably 3 decades ago, not many people knew much about medieval Spain other than the year 1492 as the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? So we know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and this starts off this whole age of exploration. Little less well-known fact about 1492 is that it's the year that the last Nasrid rulers of Granada were ousted by Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the monarchs of Castilla, the major kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages at this time. And Isabella and Ferdinand are known as the Reyes Católicos, or the kind of Catholic monarchs, because of their drive for for a Reconquista effort. And so the history of Spain is often told in terms of Reconquista and reconquest. So the story goes that Spain was invaded by Muslim forces in 711. And since that time, there has been a core group of people in Spain that developed these Christian kingdoms and tried to push the Muslim presence out. This also gave Isabella and Ferdinand an excuse to launch all their imperialist efforts and for their growing power. And it legitimized the way that they had been kind of growing their empire. If you go to Spain now, the national love of ham seems to signal that Spain has always been Catholic and that the Jewish and Muslim populations have never been welcome there. But we know, in fact, that that's not really the case. And a lot of people have become fascinated with Spain lately. And the nice thing is, for us, that means that you can get tapas in Healdsburg, and you can get like fancy clothes at Zara. Now, in the realm of art history, this has meant an explosion of studies of the art and architecture of the Iberian Peninsula, especially during the Middle Ages. And so here I'll return to this map so you can see how Al-Andalus in the beginning or in the middle of the 8th century to the end kind of stretched all across the entire Iberian Peninsula, and then it did shrink throughout the years. But the story of how this happened and how much this was a question of Christians against Muslims and Christians on this crusade to oust the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula is the question that we're tackling here. And for the most part, people have thought of the areas in the north as these Christian strongholds, and the areas in the south as this increasingly shrinking area of the Iberian Peninsula that has lost its grip on its holdings there. And it said that when the last Nasrid ruler of Granada was ousted from his home, his mother turned to him and said, "Do not weep like a woman for that which you could not defend as a man." It's not very nice. But to be fair, this is the home that she was occupying before they had to leave. And so if you had to leave this as your home, you might be pretty upset at the person who was responsible for making you do that. But the other thing that people aren't quite as aware of with the Spanish Middle Ages or the Middle Ages in the Iberian Peninsula is how much it's responsible for what Spain looks like politically today. So this is what Spain looked like, or the Iberian Peninsula looked like in the middle of the 12th to the 13th centuries. And this is what it looks like now. So the contemporary political borders with all the different regions that are differentiated really come from the history of the Middle Ages. And that's a little bit of what we're going to be exploring today. So in this town, in the region of Navarra, which is in the north, you have the town of Torres del Rio, which is indicated here by this little symbol here. And nestled in this little area, in the area between the Basque Country and La Rioja, really at the borders, you have this little area where the Church of the Santo Sepulcro is. And there it is in all of its glory. And this became the subject of my dissertation. It's located in this small town. As I said, it has about 170 inhabitants. And the church kind of is in this, situated in this little, maybe a little bit of a privileged location in the eastern entrance to the town. And you can see that surrounding the town, there isn't very much. And this fits in very nicely with the Romanesque architectural landscape of Navarra. It's a region that has really retained a lot of its Romanesque architecture. And it's also a region where the building style continued to be done in what you would call a Romanesque manner way into the later 13th and 14th centuries, when other places are building in a more Gothic style. So while that's happening, you have this kind of slower to adopt areas, particularly in the countryside, where you're still retaining those building practices from a little bit earlier. And what that does is make the countryside right now look a little bit more Romanesque than it actually looked in the Middle Ages. So you have churches like the Santo Sepulcro that was constructed probably between 1160 and 1180, but you also have churches that look Romanesque that were constructed in the 13th or 14th centuries. And so in some sense, this gives you this false idea of how Romanesque the landscape actually looked. So here's what the church looks like and the plan of it. And as you can see, it has a central plan, but it has also a marked east-west access, delineated by the apse here, which is here, and the stair tower, which is most likely a later addition, but kind of adding that nice linear direction as well. And that's what it looks like from the other side, the stair tower, and then the apse from head-on, from the east side. Despite its location and the smallness of the church and stuff, the church actually gets quite a lot of visitors. And it's because it's on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. And so people line up almost on a daily basis to go look at this church. And so it has that kind of fame. And most of the people who, if you look it up on the internet, a lot of people do talk about it because they traverse the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela and they kind of encounter it on their way. But if you go to this town, the inhabitants of the town aren't very excited about this church. And in fact, the first time I went to this church, I was very excited. I'm like, I think I'm gonna write this, my dissertation maybe about this church. It's gonna be exciting. And then you get to go to drive around the Spanish countryside and go look at it. I was like, this is gonna be amazing. And I ended up with all these things go awry on the trip. And I couldn't get a car. I ended up with a bus. So it was like planes, trains, and automobiles to get there. And I finally get to this town where there's one bus into the town a day and then one bus out of the town a day. So I get there and I'm excited and I get to the church and there's a sign that says, if you want to look at the church, ask for Aurora Benuez. And that's it. And there's no one else. There's like nothing in the town. There's like a bank and then there's like a corner store. So I walked into the corner store and asked, excuse me, do you know Aurora Benuez? And the man was like, yeah. There was a poster in the shop that had a picture of this church. It wasn't too different from this picture, in fact. And he's like, had signaled, like, there's a house here. That's Aurora Benuez's house. You can find her there. So I was like, okay. So I went to the house and I knocked on the door and she answered and I was like, hi, I'm here. My name is Robin Kim. I'm here. I'm writing my dissertation about the church here. It's very exciting. I'm very excited to present myself and to ask her to open this church for me. And she said, I open the church at 5 and then just slammed the door in my face. It's like, oh, well, that's not very good because the bus out of town leaves at 5:30, I think. But I did have some time to look at it. But it also was struck by how ordinary all of these churches seem. But of course, if you're European and you live in a town that has a church in it, you don't really necessarily think of it as this incredible monument that you do if you're like an American and you study medieval architecture in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Like you're a lot more excited about these monuments than the people who live there. But I would say that Aurora Benuez's feelings towards this church are very much like how a medieval person would have felt about this church in their day. It wouldn't have been very exciting. But to me it was. And so why was it exciting? It's exciting because of this picture here on the right. And it's the picture, it is a picture that's very similar to one that I encountered in Roger Stolley's survey book. When I was kind of searching for a dissertation topic, I was just looking through surveys of medieval architecture. And I saw this photo, and I thought it looked fascinating. And it looked fascinating to me because it looked like something that you might find in Islamic architecture. There's only one building that I was familiar with at the time that had a vault like this, an interlacing rib vault. And that was at the Great Mosque of Cordoba. But this is the picture that I saw. And the only thing, it was a very small blurb, and I think the only thing that Stolley had said about it was that although it was dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, like it was, it, quote, owes nothing to the anastasis. And that the impressive interlacing rib vaults were clearly an influence from the south of Spain. And here you can see how the vaulting actually works. So from the outside, the church looks like it has this nice 3-story elevation where you have this first story here that's dominated by the entryway. And then the second story has these blind arches and a couple of windows that flank the apse. And then the third story is where you have the windows. But then on the interior, that third story becomes the dome. So inside it's actually just 2 stories, and then you have a dome that has the interlacing rib vaults there, which is very interesting. And then you have nestled in between all of those ribs, you have these windows that are really dwarfed by the thickness of those thick square ribs that spring from these corbels that are at the middle of the walls, and they spring in opposite directions and land on the corbels that are to the fifth corbel to the right or left. And then in between those, you have these windows. You have details on them here on the right. And that was the only, aside from the windows flanking the apse, the only illumination from the space. So you can really imagine how that makes the dome kind of glow from the bottom part, which is fascinating. But this is the anastasis, and so you can see why Stolley had said, perhaps, that it owes nothing to the anastasis, because it doesn't really have that much in common with it, other than that it's a dome. But of course, you can see from the dome of the anastasis, most of the light kind of pours in from the center, more like the Pantheon. And aside from its central plan, there isn't really that much that is referencing this structure, although a lot of art historians would think so. This is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, or the the dome that's over the mihrab of the Great Mosque of Cordoba on the right. And this is the monument that I was familiar with that used an interlacing rib vault. So I thought, wow, this is fascinating, because what did I learn about Navarre upon my initial research? Well, I learned that after the Muslims kind of first come into Spain across the Straits of Gibraltar from North Africa in 711, they quickly take over most of the Iberian Peninsula and get all the way up to southern France. And then there is, according to legend, this one king called Peleo, and he's from Asturias, which is all the way up in the north. And Asturias and the Basque Country are both these like kind of inhospitable-ish areas because they're very mountainous. And so it was thought that there was these resistance movements that began high in these mountains. And so Asturias was thought to be the beginning point of that. And then so the north has less and less of the Islamic influences because they managed to push back the Muslim forces before southern Spain did. And so while in the south of Spain you have these big monuments that are built, like the Great Mosque of Cordoba, that stand as the kind of a testament to the Islamic past, you have less of that in the north. And the thought was that because they were so early to get rid of the Muslim presence, there wasn't time for any of that artistic legacy to take hold in the north and to influence its architecture like it did in the south. But it's not the only dome that's used in, or what I should say is the interlacing rib vault that you see at Torres del Rio, at the Santo Sepulcro, is not the only time you see Christian architecture employing an interlacing rib vault. I later found out that there are a few more. These top two are in Spain. There's the San Miguel in Almazan. There's the Las Juergas in Burgos. And then you have two examples in southern France, at Allons, Sainte-Marie, and the Hôpital Saint-Blaise. So these also use an interlacing rib vault design. These have been seen as obvious influences from Cordoba and are written about in those terms. But there's something that happens to the history of Navarra that really didn't allow that to be part of what the nation or what the region thought of as its kind of national identity, as its historical identity, as its political identity. Navarra is seen as this Christian stronghold, and the idea was that Pamplona was this locus of Christian power that grew and grew and grew until it became the Kingdom of Navarre, and then is completely free from any Muslim influences because of how early on all of that happened. So that's the general accepted history of Navarre. But I think that what happened in the region is a lot more complicated than that. And the reason why I think so is because of the little church, the small church of the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio. Most studies of, excuse me, kind of got a little ahead of myself. Most studies of the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio locate it within the contemporary borders of Navarra. What I mean is that when they speak about the context of the Santo Sepulcro, they're using contemporary political borders. So they're speaking about what architecture that's in this little region here. That's a little bit dishonest, in my opinion, because this church didn't exist in the political context of Navarra in the 21st century, but it existed in the context of the Kingdom of Navarra in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the borders of the regions of Spain were in constant flux. And so, at one point, Navarra was actually, in the 11th century, Navarra encompassed almost all of the north. But then, of course, there were succession crises and a lot of infighting between brothers who are supposed to rule the regions, and so they got split up into different kingdoms. And this happens to a lot of areas of the Iberian Peninsula. And so it's not really that useful to use our contemporary borders to talk about medieval Navarra. The other thing that that does is that it kind of limits the comparanda that you have for the church that we're looking at. And so when you read art historical scholarship that's produced in Navarra, they talk about how there's no architecture in Navarra that looks like that church, or there's no architecture in Navarra that seems to signal that there was a Muslim influence in any of the arts of the Iberian Peninsula at the time. However, that claim is only easy to make if you use the contemporary borders of Navarra. And indeed, if you look at Navarra today, you don't really see that many examples of anything that you would think was influenced by Islamic arts. But if you look at an area that goes beyond the contemporary borders, you have a different picture starting to form. And so I propose to contextualize the Santo Sepulcro not within the contemporary borders of Navarra, but something more akin to what might have been the zone of influence of medieval Navarra. Here I have this map that shows you where we are, the church that we're looking at, and then all of these other zones that I consider possible zones of influence for the architecture. And I'll go through why I think that's the case. For one, the medieval borders of Navarra actually extended out to this far. And at one point, Nájera, which is here and not and certainly outside of what are the borders of contemporary Navarra, was very much a part of medieval Navarra. And it wasn't just a part of medieval Navarra, it was the de facto capital of Navarra after Abd al-Rahman III had kind of destroyed a lot of Pamplona in the 10th century. The capital gets effectively moved, or at least the court and all of the dealings get moved to Nájera over here. So the way that that becomes the center of Navarrese activity shouldn't be ignored. And then the other thing is that this is a church that's dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre, was founded by the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. And the way that the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre ended up in this region is that they first established themselves in Zaragoza, in Calatayud, and then in Logroño. And so this whole area is in the zone of influence of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. And then the other area that gets left out, and then these are regions that are in the region of Aragon, and so they're usually not talked about when you look at medieval architecture in Navarra. And the other area that I want to look at, which is in contemporary Navarra, is this city here called Tudela. And that's interesting to me because Tudela was a part of medieval Navarra, and it's also a part of Navarra today. However, it's not really discussed in medieval architectural studies of Navarra because it was controlled by Muslim rulers until 1119 and then handed over to Christian rulers. But it doesn't enter, Tudela does not enter the discussions of medieval art and architecture until the 13th century when a kind of a Gothic church was built there. And so all of the Islamic architecture that existed in Tudela is kind of forgotten about when we're talking about a context for medieval architecture. This is a shame because Tudela was one of the most opulent cities, and for sure, the most opulent city in that area of Navarra. It had been an urban zone since the 8th century and had been built up. And at that point, it had a mosque. It had several mosques. It was a pretty important city and was a larger city than Pamplona or Nájera, really. And so how that gets left out of discussions is a little bit tricky as well. But today we're going to try to remedy all that, and I'll give you a little bit of, or I'll give you some examples, and you can decide if you think that they are within the list of things that you would consider as influential to that church in Torres del Rio. The first example I want to take a look at is called Santa Maria de los Arcos in Tricio. It's in this area. It was probably a little bit of an urban area that had kind of Roman roots as a pottery manufacturing town or something. The most interesting thing about this church was built in the 10th century, is the reuse of these giant columns in the interior of the church. As you can see, these columns, which are thought to maybe be leftover remnants from the city's Roman occupation time, are used to hold up this church, as you can see. And you can see that some of the columns, or most of the columns, are incomplete. Some of them are just shafts. This one is just a part of the shaft, really. It doesn't really have any of the art. It doesn't have like the right parts to make a complete column, but they're just kind of like drums of shafts that are piled on top of each other to make a sort of columnar base. You can tell that some emphasis has been given over to the East End because of the different, because there are a couple of capitals that are there, so it looks a little bit more decorated and complete on the East End. But for sure, these are reused elements. And they're reused, some people think, and I would agree with them, because they were practically available, meaning it was very practical to reuse giant column drums. Like you have church architecture being built in the north of Spain, and as much as some people argue that the north of Spain had been a Christian stronghold, there are others who maintain that the north of Spain was actually very slow to adopt Christianity. And so there was this time when at the Council of Toledo, or the Council of Nicaea, they adopt kind of the tenets of Christianity. So it's kind of thought in the 5th and 6th century, everyone is Catholic in the north of Spain, but that might not be true. And there's some people who suggest that they weren't Christian. So even in the 10th century, Christianity was kind of like a newer religion in the area. And so you needed to build a church for this religion that's becoming more and more popular in the area, but you might not have a lot of the monetary resources that you would have if you were, say, in another region where Christianity had been established for a long time, for hundreds of years, and people are really practicing this. So this is an example of the way that the practical side of construction really influences the way that churches can look, and you can read into them in all different kinds of ways. But the fact that there were these Roman elements in this church, it was allowed to just kind of exist, really. And sometimes without meaning, sometimes just because it was practical. But then what that means is that you have a church that has these Roman elements. And then not only does it have these right now it has a lot of elements because it's been kind of reconstructed and restored over time. So you have some like Baroque elements too. So that's a later addition. And for some reason we think that that's okay and normal, but we think of the Middle Ages as constructing buildings that were like constructed and they used one kind of visual vocabulary, and that's what was built. But if you look at this example, you can see how you needed to have building materials. There were some practical concerns, and then the result of that was a church that had different building styles. So you have these Roman columns, you have a kind of a Roman-esque kind of shape to the vaulting, and then you can't really see it in photos, and I don't have a photo of it, but you also have little pieces of an apse mosaic that scholars have found that do have these kind of geometric designs that seem to be an influence from Islamic architecture. And in fact, a lot of scholars have suggested that there was a continued presence of Muslims actually in the area long after they thought that they were ousted, and that they really did form a part of the elite and really contributed to the aesthetics of the visual culture of the area greatly. My next example comes from Tudela. And as I said, Tudela is interesting because of just because of its history and that it was occupied it was under Muslim domination until 1119. And then after that, what happens is you have Christian forces, in this case Alfonso el Batallador, kind of coming in and taking over. But we imagine that to happen in these extreme and violent ways. And I think that when we think about that moment in history, people have a tendency to think that what happens is there's a new Christian ruler, and there's like a battle, and people die, and then the Christian rulers are there, and then everyone who's Muslim has to flee, and there's exiles, and there's pillaging, and then there's a whole new Christian population there. But that's not really how it happens. And if you think practically, that couldn't have been what happens. Generally, what happened was, I mean, there were a lot of battles. It's not to say that it wasn't a violent time. It was a very violent time, and there were, people vying for power all the time. But the truth is, a lot of the violence was occurring, Christian kingdom against Christian kingdom as well. What happens generally, though, and often the case, and what happened with Tudela, what happened with Toledo, what happened with a lot of these towns, was that there would be a long period of negotiation. There'd be like maybe some battles, but Christian and Muslim rulers were very aware of each other. And in fact, in the 12th century, starting in the 10th century probably, there was a lot of teaming up between Christian kingdoms and Muslim kingdoms. A lot of the Muslim-controlled lands, as we saw, shrank, as you saw in those maps. And as that happens, they lose some of their political power. And as that happens, they decide to not have militaries anymore. And what happens, instead of you maintaining a military, you just pay protection money to a Christian ruler. And you're like, oh, here's some money. And they're like, okay, we'll like lend you our military. And so that's what actually happens. And then you conquer, you get there. And then instead of having to start from scratch, because if you actually did execute all the Muslims and then try to bring in a whole new Christian population, you'd have to, first of all, execute all those people or get rid of them. And then you have no infrastructure. Who's going to do anything in your town? Who will maintain the roads? Who will farm? Who's going to maintain all the irrigation that all of these Muslim landscapers and scientists who know how to irrigate things put in, and that's how you get all your food. So you have to maintain the population. So oftentimes people were asked to stay, and in Tudela in Navarra, the Muslim population was actually given a lot more concessions than any other part of the Iberian Peninsula. So while we think of Navarra as this area of Christian domination, it's actually an area in which the Muslims were given a lot more freedom and just rights after the change happened. And so there were certain laws against taking their property. There are certain laws against taking their jobs, and there's certain protections put in place so they could guarantee their place in society and could continue to maintain the brilliant opulence of the city that was there. And so what happens is there's the Great Mosque. Like most cities that have a Muslim population have a big mosque, a Friday mosque, where that has to be large enough to accommodate the entire male population. They're supposed to go every Friday to the mosque. And so, of course, Tudela had one. And but what happens is that those like big monuments usually get taken over by the new rulers, and that is what happened in Tudela. But the Muslims were allowed to worship in that temple for like a year while they were building another temple, another mosque in what's called the Moreria, or the kind of Moorish neighborhood, where they were it was kind of outside of the walls of, the kind of urban zone of Tudela. They were building a whole other neighborhood where the Muslims would presumably move to, and then make room for the new Christian population who was going to take over the main kind of downtowny area. And so there was another mosque that was being constructed in a whole other zone. So not only is there a lot of Islamic inspired architecture there, but there's new architecture being built in the 12th century of Islamic design in the region of Navarre. So you can see here, this map here, this is, pardon me, and in Navarre, this is a map that that shows you kind of, this is our zone of influence that I've been talking about, which is kind of this area here. And it's very close to what this area, which is labeled the Banu Qazi dynasty. And they're a family that became very powerful throughout the 10th century. And they built the great, they're responsible for a lot of the building of Tudela. And the Great Mosque of Tudela was started under their rule. And we don't know what the Great Mosque of Tudela looked like. And this is the part of my talk where I kind of have to ask you to use a lot of your imagination, because there aren't a lot of extant examples of Islamic architecture in the north. But we do have a little bit of an idea of what it looked like. So obviously, the Great Mosque of Cordoba is the most famous monument on the Iberian Peninsula. And it was most likely the most opulent and brilliant monument on the Iberian Peninsula. Cordoba was the capital of the Islamic world of Al-Andalus, remained so up until the caliphate kind of splintered into these petty kingdoms, but it still maintained its brilliance. It was expanded several times, and so it was maintained and expanded. The other monuments, though, did not really survive as well as that mosque. And so here I have an example of one that did. It's in Toledo, and it's called the Bab al-Dun. It's called the Mezquita de la Luz now, or the Cristo de la Luz now. It's been decommissioned, I think. But if we can imagine, and this is a small private mosque, so it's a really tiny mosque, and this is what it looks like on the inside. It has like some elements that you might recognize from the Great Mosque of Cordoba, if you're familiar with it. These like horseshoe arches, this kind of hypo-style plan that's like columns without the kind of hierarchical structure of a Western church, let's say. But this is what it looks like. It's now, I think it's constantly under reconstruction or restoration. But this is what the vaulting looks like. And if you've noticed, it has a pretty spectacular interlacing rib vault kind of showcased in the center. It's a tiny, tiny mosque. So if you can imagine that there are other mosques in the region, you might imagine that they kind of sit somewhere between like what this tiny mosque looked like and what the Great Mosque of Cordoba looked like. And I would suggest that that there were a lot of these buildings that kind of looked like this little mosque, somewhere in between, probably some mosques that were a little bit bigger and some mosques that were that same size, but built according to similar aesthetics. And I say that because of the general idea, and this is one that's generally accepted in the art history community, one that was brought up by Geraldine Dodds, who's kind of one of the most well-established scholars of Islamic art on the Iberian Peninsula. And she has suggested and argued that Islamic art on the Iberian Peninsula is particular. It's particular because it's a combination of a nostalgia for Syria, where the family, where the Umayyad dynasty kind of had to flee from, and a combination of the indigenous forms that were found on the Iberian Peninsula prior to the Muslim arrival there. So there are these what are called Visigothic forms, like the horseshoe arches, that were adopted by the Umayyads. So I'll give you a quick little story. The Umayyads, this is kind of very Game of Thrones-ish kind of sounding, but the Umayyads were the caliphate in Damascus. It's only maybe a couple of generations after the Prophet Muhammad has passed away and has started this religion that's really sweeping the Middle East and North Africa by storm. Everyone is converting. But then the Umayyads come to power, and they are overthrown by the Abbasids. And so they're overthrown, and everyone in the Umayyad family is murdered, except one person, one lone prince. And he escapes on foot in the dead of night. And he escaped with like one trusted assistant. And they make their way to North Africa. And from North Africa, they send out scouts and they arrive on the Iberian Peninsula and they report back and say, okay, this place is ripe for conquering. They're like, there's this Visigothic empire that's like ruling over there, but there's like infighting. They don't really have control of so many of the hinterlands. It's really kind of just based around Toledo in the center, and everything that's kind of outside in the periphery is just kind of up for grabs. They're like, we can do this. And so Abd al-Rahman sends his like best soldiers. I don't know if it's his best soldier. He sends a soldier to go do his bidding. And so they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, and within years, just a few years, they conquer so much of the Iberian Peninsula. They get all the way up to France, like we saw. And so her thinking is that because of this horrible, tragic story and this kind of nostalgia for their homeland of Syria, they imported a lot of their forms. And they also import a lot of things like orange trees and date trees, date palms, irrigation, scientists, medicine, all of these things, the Arabic language. But they import all these things and combine it with what's already here, namely the horseshoe arches from the Visigoths. And they invent this new kind of style of Islamic architecture, one that's particular to the Iberian Peninsula, and one that's particularly influenced by what's sometimes referred to as the convivencia, or the living together of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, which for a long time was thought to be unique to the Iberian Peninsula, but is now thought of as more of the spirit of the Mediterranean. You can find it in Italy as well, and so this is what's kind of thought of as the way that cultures interact and how it manifests in architecture. And this is how it manifested in architecture in the Iberian Peninsula. But the dome is not the only thing that makes me think that you can look at the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio as part of that legacy and a part of that tradition. And so you have here what are called modillions, and they're modillions that are, this is an example of the modillions that are at the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio. I don't have a picture that's exactly like this profile, but this is a drawing of a modillion that was done by a scholar who studied the Great Mosque of Tudela. They kind of excavated parts of it. Right now there's like a plaza on top of it. But in the course of their excavations, they found one of these modillions, which is thought to have been like pretty typical and on the building that's not too far away from our area, the Santo Sepulcro. The other thing that makes me want to compare the Santo Sepulcro to those other monuments on the Iberian Peninsula is this kind of small detail. I have the triumphal arch and the entry to the apse here, and there are several sculpted capitals all along in the church and on the exterior too, but there are only two that are historiated or that tell a narrative, say. And they both have this really nice impost block with these like vining vegetal patterns here. And they look very similar to a couple of the voussoirs, or these parts that make up an arch that are at the one of the entrances to the Great Mosque of Cordoba. There's the entrance called the Puerta de San Esteban. And if you look at this voussoir in particular here, this is a drawing of it so you can see it more clearly. It looks very similar to the impost block that's from Torres del Rio, just put on its side. So it's things like this that make me think that there is an aesthetic element that traveled from the south of Spain all the way to the north, which could have been by all those other mosques that were probably in the area. So the other zone of influence I wanted to show you was in this area called in Zaragoza, which is in Aragon now, but it was one of the closest kind of Taifa kingdoms that was able to succeed for a little bit longer than Tudela was. So it stayed in Muslim-controlled hands longer than Tudela did. And I think it looks pretty much like, like a stereotypical medieval castle, right? It looks like what you would imagine a medieval castle to look like. And it's complete with these turrets. I mean, it's heavily restored now too, but it has these turrets, flags, a drawbridge, and an impressive entryway. It looks kind of like a very fancy medieval times, like a very fancy medieval, not very, but it does capture what we think of as the Middle Ages. But what's interesting to me about it is that you also think of the Middle Ages as this time of like Christian knights and Christianity, but this was a Muslim palace. You can see it even has like a moat, you guys. Like a moat and a drawbridge, and like you can imagine like a lady with a conical hat like roaming around this premises. It's amazing. And this is what some of the inside looks like. So not unlike those other brilliant monuments on the Iberian Peninsula, like if you went to Granada or Sevilla or saw these monuments in the south of Spain that are part of Islamic design. You can see some of it also in the north. So this is in Aragon. It's amazing. And you can see, I mean, if there are any people who are into garden design and irrigation, these gardens certainly give you a lot of ideas of how you can irrigate water through them with fountains and all these amazing brickwork and stuff. It's great. But this is an important monument because it lets us know what Islamic architecture kind of in the north might have looked like. And not just this building, but all of those areas that might have also had a residual Islamic population after the kingdom was taken over. Because as we discussed, you generally kind of tried to get the people to stay so that you would have a city with infrastructure. Inside of that complex, there's a small mosque that is octagonal and also has a pretty impressive interlacing roof vault. Now, this vault in particular is restored, and so it's not the original vault, but there is good cause to believe that the original building in the Middle Ages did have an interlacing roof vault, and so this is kind of a reconstruction of that, and not just an entire imagining. But this is likely kind of at least a little bit of what it looked like. And so there are a lot of similarities that we can see between these two structures, I think, aside from the octagonal plan, which I think is pretty obvious. But you have kind of 2 stories and an interlacing roof vault. Not only do you have those 2 stories crowned by an interlacing roof vault, you also have this little detail. This is the mihrab, or the niche that kind of points in the way of Mecca, which is usually a very small niche in a wall. But here it's expanded a little bit, I think. And that, I think, is comparable to the apse that you see at the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio, which is actually pretty small. So here you have kind of a larger mihrab, and then here you have a smaller apse. In those ways, I think that those structures are similar too. I'm not suggesting that this monument was the model for the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio. I'm not saying that someone saw the mosque at the Aljaferia Palace and was like, this is great, we'll build one for you. When the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre were like, we need a church in Torres del Rio, they didn't just hire someone to make one that looked just like the Aljaferia Palace, but it is what architecture in the area looked like. And here I have a map of the different areas that are confirmed to have had a residual Muslim population in the area that we're looking at. So it's pretty impressive, like the number. Of course, like around here, you're going to have a little bit more because you have Tudela and then you have Zaragoza close by. But still, even in this area, this is where Torres del Rio is, you have residual populations that are very close by. And the way that medieval construction worked is it's likely that the workers needed to build the church here were found somewhere along this zone where the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre kind of had property and were building things, so that they most likely hired their masons from around the area and hired the people to build from the area. And so these are people who would have been influenced by the architecture that you see in Zaragoza, that you see in any of these towns. All of these towns also would have had their own mosque. And so the amount of Islamic architecture that would have been in the region is kind of astounding to think about, which is now mostly thought of as a very Romanesque landscape. And so I wanted to, before we end, I wanted to take a look at a couple of these structures that are not the focus of my talk, but are also in Navarra and are never talked about in terms of Islamic influence. There are three churches that use these kind of polylobed arches with these kind of decorative arches in place of like a triumphal arch, which you might normally find in a medieval church. So in a medieval church, usually you have the entryway with sculptural elements, but often those sculptural elements will depict something like Christ in triumph, something about the Bible, usually. But here you have these patterned, these and mostly geometric and vegetal patterns on these arches. Now, polylobed arches are thought of as an anomaly in that kind of area for the time period. And most scholars who study those churches that I just showed you compare those polylobed arches to those in France. And their general narrative is that polylobed arches might have been developed in the Islamic arts in kind of Spain, but then they moved to France, and it was from France that they moved to the south of Spain. I think that's very complicated. And in order to make that assessment, you have to kind of adjust the timeline for when you think that those monuments were built, and you have to think that they were built a little bit later than they were. But if we look kind of closer than France, and you looked at Zaragoza, you see that in the Aljaferia Palace, polylobed arches are used quite frequently, and they usually delineate points of entry, like you see here. It's just a whole bunch of them. And here, this is the entry to the mosque. And then here you have another kind of nice entryway. I compare these because not only do you have these polylobes here, these like lobed elements here, that you can that I think have been borrowed from the Islamic arts, but you also have a flattening of the space here, where these arches actually come out quite a bit. And the door is recessed into the wall. And it's, I don't have a very good picture of it. You can see it, but it actually recesses pretty far. But the effects of the surface patterning of their arches, instead of having like a triumphal arch that recedes back, you have these vegetal and geometric patterns that just make this kind of a pattern. It kind of flattens the space. And it kind of reminds me of the way that these spaces are flattened. And this comprises arches that kind of that overlap each other in very complicated ways, when like this part of the arch goes under this part of the arch, but it's over this part of the arch. So there's a real three-dimensionality to what's going on with those arches, but they've been flattened into this two-dimensional plane, which is what I think happens with the polylobes here that we look at. Polylobes can also be found, though, at the Santo Sepulcro and Torres del Rio. Remember when we looked at those? The little windows comprise a couple of elements. They have this lattice work here, these stone grills, which are all kind of various patterns that that look similar to other medieval arts. And then you have this lobed arch and these turrets, which might represent the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But what you have that's going on here is that this kind of polylobed arch doesn't really look like the polylobes that you have in the Aljaferia Palace, or even the ones that you have that seem to be perhaps influenced by them. Instead, you have polylobes that look almost like trefoils, or that kind of the pattern that you see in medieval, late Romanesque and Gothic architecture, usually, that have these either 3 or 4 kind of lobed designs. And so this has a kind of a more Western element to it, a kind of Christian Western medieval architectural style to it. And then you also have in this pattern, instead of grills that you might find in Islamic arts that take advantage of this geometric patterning that the Islamic arts are so famous for, you have patterns that look a little bit more like like ones you would find in Western arts, and patterns that you might find in sculptural designs. So that's what I think kind of happens with the Santo Sepulcro and Torres del Rio. So instead of something that looks exactly Christian or exactly Muslim, you have elements that are allowed to coexist at this time and not be associated with either religion necessarily. But they've kind of evolved beyond those to form what I call a regional aesthetic. And in this region, it included all of these elements that we, as 21st century art historians, kind of separate into Islamic arts, into what's called mudéjar, or arts that was made for Christian patrons by Muslim artisans who were kind of remained in the Iberian Peninsula after it was taken over by Christian forces. And so this is the lesson that I think that we can learn from the Santo Sepulcro in Torres del Rio, that sometimes things that might look extraordinary to 21st century eyes, because we have very rigid ideas of what is Christian and what is Muslim, actually are a lot more mutable and complicated than that. Thank you. Great, thanks. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at, there are more in the Aljaferia Palace than what I showed you, but there aren't, I mean, I don't know of that many specifically about that. But you're asking me about the overlapping arch, that pattern in particular where you have the arches overlapping each other. Yeah, those, I don't know of other examples off the top of my head. But that is a pattern that you can definitely see in a lot of different areas of the Aljaferia, in that building for sure. Yeah. Yeah, Amy.
Is there any kind of known maybe local symbolism to the specific, either the number of points of sort of the star design, or any kind of kind of traditions surrounding ideal geometry or anything like that you found when you went there, or?
I mean, not in the. Amy was asking me about maybe the symbolism of the geometry of the 8-pointed stars that the interlacing ribs form. I mean, not specifically of the region, and there's nothing that is in the scholarship of the region that kind of points to that. And I think that if I were to look more at the geometry of Islamic arts, for sure, you find a lot of symbolism there, and you also find a lot of symbolism with the number 8 in Christian mystical ideologies and philosophies too. But there wasn't anything specific to that region that was like, oh yeah, we're really into this kind of symbology. And in fact, there was, I mean, I'd say no, but they were kind of maybe into like centrally planned a little bit more than in some other areas. So that kind of geometry for sure. And I know that in this small town, there's a tiny town, but there was like another church prior to this that confuses some scholars. That's no longer extant, but we know that was centrally planned as well. And then you saw the Aljaferia uses that design. And then there's another church that's maybe like an hour's drive away from this one that is an octagonal plan as well. So there is something to that for sure, that they thought it was important. But there's still little that's extant that it's hard to say. Yeah, so thanks. If there are no other questions, I'll just thank you for your time and attention.